Imagine waking up one morning in January 1920. The sheets beneath you are rough. The mattress pokes at your back with stray horsehair, and the radiator hisses in the corner, barely warming the small boarding house room you call home. Outside, the streets of America are alive in a way that feels almost electric. Jazz melodies drift through alleys. Whispers of forbidden cocktails flutter behind hidden doors, and the city hums with an energy that promises anything could happen tonight. When most people think of the Roaring Twenties, they picture glamorous parties, flappers twirling in sequins, champagne fountains, and endless jazz in opulent ballrooms. But the real story is far more layered, vibrant, and sometimes dangerous. The decade was a collision of innovation, rebellion, and social transformation. People didn't just drink and dance, they were reshaping culture, redefining freedom, and inventing new ways to spend their precious leisure time. Prohibition may have outlawed alcohol, but it didn't stop Americans from finding ways to drink. Instead, it pushed nightlife underground. Secret entrances, whispered passwords, and dimly lit speakeasies became the heart of social life. For the first time, men and women mingled openly in public spaces, sharing drinks, laughter, and the thrill of breaking the law together. But this excitement came at a cost. The illegal alcohol trade was dangerous, and organized crime moved in to control the booming market. Enterprising gangs transformed social hubs into tense, high-stakes environments, adding an edge to every night out. And then there were the flappers. Young women boldly defied Victorian conventions, cutting their hair, shortening their skirts, and dancing with a freedom that shocked older generations. The Charleston, Black Bottom, and other new dances weren't just entertainment, they were physical expressions of liberation. Every spin, kick, and sway represented a small rebellion, a celebration of individuality and social progress. The streets, dance halls, and even house parties became stages for this cultural revolution, where youth explored new identities and pleasures. But the 1920s weren't just about nightlife. Technology was changing how Americans spent their free time. Radio brought music and stories into living rooms across the country. Silent films introduced audiences to heroes, villains, and dazzling worlds beyond their own neighborhoods. And the automobile didn't just get people from point A to B, unlocked the freedom to explore, to vacation on a whim, and to redefine family leisure. Road trips and auto camping transformed ordinary weekends into miniature adventures across the country. In this video, we are going to take you on a journey through the everyday thrills and extraordinary innovations of 1920s America. You'll meet flappers, gangsters, sports heroes, and inventors of leisure. You'll step into speakeasies, dance halls, and early suburban streets. By the end, you'll see that the Roaring Twenties weren't just a time of flashy parties. They were a period that reshaped the way Americans played, socialized, and experienced freedom. Before we dive in, if you enjoy exploring history in vivid detail, consider giving this video a like and subscribing to the channel. Your support helps us bring more stories to life and keeps the adventure going. And now, get comfortable, just those pillows, grab a blanket and let us travel back a century to discover how Americans really spent their free time in the Roaring Twenties. When we picture the Roaring Twenties in our minds, it's easy to get swept away by the sparkling glamour of it all, imagining streets lined with neon lights, flappers spinning effortlessly across polished dance floors, champagne flowing endlessly from golden fountains, and jazz bands playing with feverish energy in opulent ballrooms where everyone, it seems, is caught up in the same rhythm of carefree revelry. Movies and television have long reinforced this image, presenting the decade almost as a never-ending carnival of indulgence. It's an era where life was one glorious, glittering party from morning until night. Yet, the reality that Americans actually lived was far more complex, far more intense, and in many ways, far more dangerous than these glossy portrayals would have us believe. For the decade was not simply defined by its style or its music, but by a deep undercurrent of social experimentation, economic upheaval, and cultural transformation that reshaped the very way people spent their time, how they connected with one another, and even how they understood freedom itself. Beneath the sequined dresses and the clinking of cocktail glasses existed a society negotiating boundaries that had been strictly imposed for generations, where men and women were suddenly navigating new social spaces, new forms of entertainment, and new temptations, all against the backdrop of a nation still reeling from the aftershocks of the First World War and grappling with the enormous changes brought by industrialization and urbanization. It's a picture-perfect jazz age that so often captivates our imagination, ignores the grit, the improvisation, and the constant negotiation of risk that defined everyday life. The thrill of slipping into a hidden speakeasy behind the unassuming doors of a shuttered saloon, the careful memorization of secret passwords to gain entry, and the quiet thrill of defying laws that had been intended to protect but often only fueled creativity, audacity, and, inevitably, danger. It is this tension between the idealized fantasy of endless celebration and the harsher, more textured reality of what Americans actually experience that reveals the true spirit of the decade, not merely a series of parties, but a vibrant, messy, and exhilarating experiment in social liberation and cultural reinvention, where every night out could be a daring adventure, every dance a statement of independence, and every shared drink a quiet act of rebellion, against a society still learning to balance tradition with the irresistible allure of modernity. In understanding this contrast, we begin to see that the Roaring Twenties were not simply about entertainment. They were about transformation. And the way Americans spent their free time was both a reflection of and a catalyst for that transformation, capturing the aspirations, anxieties, and boundless creativity of a generation eager to explore what it truly meant to be free in a world that was rapidly, irrevocably changing. Beneath the glittering surface of sequins, jazz, and high-spirited dances, the 1920s were anything but a carefree parade of endless celebration. Instead, they were a decade charged with intensity, teeming with risks, and pulsating with transformation that touched every facet of American social life, from the hidden corners of smoky speakeasies to the brightly lit avenues where automobiles rattled past storefronts newly outfitted with electric signage, signaling a world that was moving faster than anyone could fully comprehend. And yet, somehow, people were eager to keep pace. The outlawing of alcohol under Prohibition did not dampen the nation's thirst. It merely redirected it into darkened basements and secret back rooms, where the thrill of defying the law added a dangerous edge to every social encounter, where gangsters in sharply tailored suits, their eyes constantly scanning the room, orchestrated the flow of illicit spirits, and where patrons, both men and women, navigated these spaces with a mixture of exhilaration and unease, fully aware that a single wrong move could invite violence or ruin. And yet, the desire to belong, to participate in this forbidden culture, outweighed fear, for in those moments of shared secrecy and indulgence, Americans were not merely drinking, they were asserting their freedom, testing the boundaries of society, and collectively participating in an experiment in modern social life that had no precedent in the country's history. Every evening brought a cascade of contrasts. The elegance of carefully choreographed dances played out alongside the unpredictable dangers of criminal enterprises. The high-pitched laughter of young women whose bobbed hair and daring fashion choices flouted decades of conservative norms, mingled with the sharp clink of hidden bottles and the hushed negotiations of organized crime. And the thrill of innovation, whether in the newest dance craze, the latest jazz composition, or the emergence of home entertainment through phonographs and radios, collided with the very real consequences of excess, injury, or legal peril, reminding everyone that this was a decade defined not simply by indulgence, but by the tension between liberation and recklessness, opportunity and risk, excitement and the ever-present possibility of danger. Yet, it was precisely this tension that made the Roaring Twenties transformative. The era forced Americans to rethink not only how they spent their leisure, but who they were allowed to be in public spaces. What roles men and women could play, how young people could assert themselves socially, and how cultural identity could evolve in real time within cities that were expanding, electrified, and increasingly intertwined by automobiles and emerging mass media. It was a period in which every night out, every dance, every roadside adventure, and every clandestine gathering became a microcosm of change, a chance to participate in the redefinition of a society that had grown rigid under Victorian traditions and was now being stretched, pulled, and ultimately reshaped by the audacity, creativity, unyielding desire for freedom of a generation unwilling to settle for the ordinary or the expected. As the echoes of jazz and laughter spilled into the streets, an invisible revolution was underway behind the closed doors of America's cities, one that would redefine not only how people drank, but how they socialized, danced, and claimed personal freedom in a world suddenly governed by the laws of prohibition. For when the 18th Amendment took effect in 1920, banning the manufacture, sale, and transportation of alcohol, it did not quench the American thirst as lawmakers had intended, but instead pushed the nation's drinking culture into the shadows, transforming ordinary city blocks into a labyrinth of secret passages, hidden staircases, and unmarked doors where the faint glow of candlelight or the subtle clink of glasses hinted at worlds just beyond the reach of the law, and where patrons learned quickly that knowledge of a simple password, a discreet knock, or a carefully whispered phrase could be the key to entering a place brimming with forbidden pleasures, from expertly mixed cocktails and home-brewed spirits to the heady excitement of slipping past the watchful eyes of the authorities, all while being acutely aware that one wrong step could bring police raids, fines, or even violence orchestrated by the ever-present forces of organized crime, who now controlled much of the underground supply. These clandestine establishments, later immortalized as speakeasies, appeared almost overnight, often in the exact same locations where once legal saloons had operated, signaling a remarkable adaptability in both business owners and patrons alike, and creating an entire subculture that thrived on secrecy, social daring, and the sheer thrill of bending the rules. Inside, the atmosphere was intoxicatingly complex, the air thick with cigarette smoke and the scent of spirits. Jazz bands playing with an energy that seemed to defy the very law outside. And couples, sometimes strangers, just meeting for the first time dancing close, together in defiance of social norms that had once kept men and women in strictly separated spaces, while in the shadows, figures in finely tailored suits conducted business, measured risk, and ensured that the flow of liquor, money, and influence remained uninterrupted. The risk only heightened the allure. Prohibition had inadvertently elevated drinking from a mundane habit to a daring social statement, a ritualized form of rebellion where the act of taking a sip became a symbol of independence, daring, and membership in a secretive, exhilarating world that few outside its walls could ever hope to fully understand. What is most remarkable about this transformation is how it blurred lines that had long separated social classes, genders, and even racial boundaries in public life, creating spaces where a young office worker could find themselves sharing a toast with an artist, a flapper, or even a minor figure from organized crime, all bound together by a shared desire to experience the forbidden, to embrace the energy of the night, and to celebrate a culture in which risk, creativity, and audacity were just as intoxicating as the spirits themselves. In a strange, paradoxical way, Prohibition did not eliminate the pleasure of alcohol. It amplified it, making every clandestine meeting, every whispered password, and every carefully orchestrated entry into a hidden speakeasy a small adventure, a quiet act of defiance, and a vivid expression of the intensity, danger, and transformative energy that defined life in the 1920s. Almost as if overnight, the familiar faces and quiet clatter of once legal saloons vanished from city streets, leaving behind shuttered windows and locked doors, and in their place, an entirely new and clandestine world emerged. One that seemed to materialize from the shadows themselves. Speakeasies, hidden, audacious, and vibrant, sprang up with astonishing speed, often in the very buildings where saloons had once operated. Their transformation so seamless that a casual passerby might never suspect that a lively jazz band was performing in the basement below, or that couples, strangers just meeting moments before, were dancing in defiance of every conventional expectation, while the subtle glow of lamps and candles illuminated a scene brimming with energy, danger, and possibility. Business owners who had once relied on the legal sale of liquor quickly adapted, learning to conceal their goods, to memorize the ever-changing passwords, and to engineer secret entrances that might be hidden behind a false wall, a bookshelf, or the unassuming door of a pharmacy or tailor shop. And yet, despite the necessity of secrecy, the atmosphere inside was anything but timid. It was electrifying, alive with the excitement of breaking rules, with jazz notes soaring above laughter, the clinking of glasses, and the hum of whispered conversations that spanned topics from local gossip to political debate, all framed by the thrill of knowing that each sip taken was an act of defiance, a taste of freedom in a society suddenly constrained by the law. The speed with which these speakeasies appeared is nothing short of remarkable, almost as if the very fabric of the city had been rewoven overnight to accommodate a new kind of social life, one that rewarded daring, ingenuity, and social savvy. Pharmacies, soda shops, and even humble basements in residential buildings were converted into secret drinking establishments, often requiring nothing more than a password and a nod from a watchful doorman to grant entry. And the patrons, aware of the risks, eagerly participated in this elaborate dance of concealment and revelation, knowing that the experience itself, the tension, the secrecy, the shared knowledge of participating in something forbidden, was as intoxicating as the alcohol being poured behind the hidden doors. These speakeasies did more than serve drinks. They created a unique social space where men and women could mingle freely, where musicians could experiment with jazz in ways that had previously been constrained by formal venues, and where the very act of gathering became a statement, a moment of cultural and personal expression that celebrated audacity, creativity, and the thrill of living on the edge of the law. In this way, the speakeasy did more than replace the saloon. It redefined it, transforming a previously mundane social institution into a dynamic, multifaceted hub of culture, rebellion, and human connection, reflecting both the ingenuity and the risk-taking spirit of a generation eager to explore new freedoms and to remake their leisure, their relationships, and, ultimately, their society itself. All while the city pulsed above them with the ever-present hum of electric lights. Carriages replaced by automobiles in a world moving faster, louder, and more boldly than anyone had ever imagined possible. Yet, behind the glimmering lights, the intoxicating rhythms, and the thrill of defiance that made speakeasies so irresistible, a far darker reality lurked, one that was as dangerous as it was often invisible to the eager patrons swaying to jazz or whispering secrets over their cocktails. For the very alcohol that had become a symbol of freedom and rebellion was frequently adulterated, hastily brewed, or outright toxic, and the consequences could be fatal. Moonshiners and bootleggers, operating in basements, back rooms, and makeshift stills, often had little concern for safety or quality, focusing instead on speed, potency, and profit, resulting in drinks laced with methanol, industrial alcohol, or other hazardous chemicals that could leave a person gravely ill or worsen the span of an evening. Deaths from alcohol poisoning skyrocketed during the early years of Prohibition, creating an invisible shadow over the glittering world of nightlife. A reminder that the exhilaration of defying the law carried real and sometimes deadly consequences. And yet, despite the mounting danger, Americans continued to flock to speakeasies, perhaps driven by curiosity, the thrill of the forbidden, or the magnetic allure of communal rebellion, as though the very act of drinking illegally had become a declaration of courage, daring, and vitality, even as the streets outside remained oblivious to the hidden tragedies unfolding behind locked doors. The tension between exhilaration and peril was a defining feature of the era, a paradox that underscored just how transformative this period truly was, for it forced ordinary citizens to confront the unpredictable consequences of a society experimenting with freedom, law, and morality all at once, and to navigate a landscape in which pleasure and risk were inseparably intertwined, where every toast raised could carry both joy and danger, and where the collective experience of nightlife became not just entertainment, but a negotiation with fate, a ritualized balancing act in which the adrenaline of evading law enforcement mingled with the quiet awareness that the very drink in one's hand might contain poison, and that the pursuit of social liberation was, in this case, inseparable from the exercise of personal judgment, vigilance, and resilience. In this sense, the rise of illegal drinking culture was emblematic of the broader paradox of the Roaring Twenties itself, a decade that offered unprecedented freedom and opportunity, yet demanded courage, creativity, and a willingness to confront risk in order to fully participate in the exhilaration of modern life. It was a world in which the allure of clandestine speakeasies, the shared laughter of men and women defying convention, and the thrilling unpredictability of social life could coexist with very real hazards, reminding all who entered these hidden worlds that progress, liberation, and cultural transformation often came at a price, and that the story of the 1920s was as much about survival and audacity as it was about music, fashion, and forbidden cocktails. Amid the shadows of speakeasies, the clinking of clandestine glasses, and the ever-present undertone of risk from dangerously brewed spirits, another subtle but revolutionary transformation was quietly unfolding, one that would permanently alter the social fabric of America. For the secret world of Prohibition-era nightlife offered an unprecedented space in which men and women could mingle freely, laugh together, and share experiences that, just a decade earlier, would have been deemed scandalous or improper. And yet here, in the hidden alcoves and dimly lit corners of these underground establishments, the conventions that once dictated strict separation between the sexes were dissolving, replaced by a new, dynamic choreography of human interaction, where flirtation, conversation, and playful competition could take place on equal footing, and where the thrill of being seen in public with a member of the opposite sex was not merely socially acceptable, but an expression of personal autonomy and defiance against a society still steeped in Victorian ideals. This emergence of mixed-gender socializing was far more than a passing trend. It represented a seismic cultural shift, a redefinition of the rules of engagement in public life, in which young women, many of them flappers with their daring fashion, short skirts, and liberated hairstyles, moved confidently among men, claiming space in dance halls, jazz clubs, and private gatherings with an assurance that previous generations could scarcely imagine, while men adapted to a new reality in which women were not merely passive observers of social rituals, but active participants in shaping the energy, style, and pace of every interaction, from the syncopated steps of the Charleston to the lively debates over politics, art, or the latest scandal whispered across a polished bar counter. The very act of walking into a room together, sharing a toast, or exchanging a smile became charged with meaning, a visible signal of a broader transformation in which gender roles were being renegotiated and social boundaries tested. And the thrill of this new freedom was amplified by the clandestine nature of the speakeasy itself, where each shared experience carried an extra layer of excitement, danger, and intimacy, as if simply being together in public, unchaperoned and unobserved by the old moral authorities, was itself a small, exhilarating rebellion. What is most striking about this evolution is not simply that men and women began socializing more openly, but how it changed the very texture of urban life, infusing public spaces with a new vibrancy, spontaneity, and energy that radiated beyond the doors of speakeasies into dance halls, coffee houses, and eventually suburban streets, influencing patterns of courtship, fashion, and even professional interactions, and creating a generation for whom the idea of freely negotiating personal relationships in public was no longer controversial, but expected, natural, and essential to the pursuit of leisure, self-expression, and the very pleasure of being alive in a society that was rapidly shedding its rigid past in favor of experimentation, audacity, and shared adventure. As men and women reveled together in the newfound freedoms of the underground nightlife, sipping cocktails that carried with them both thrill and danger, an equally dramatic transformation was taking place in the shadows behind the speakeasy doors. For the very law intended to curb alcohol consumption had inadvertently handed unprecedented power to a new class of social architects, the gangsters, mobsters, and crime syndicates, who recognized that the nation's thirst would not be denied, and that control over the flow of illegal liquor was not merely a source of profit, but a lever of influence, fear, and dominance, allowing figures like Al Capone to carve empires out of basements, warehouses, and hidden storefronts with an efficiency and ruthlessness that seemed almost mechanical, turning once ordinary neighborhoods into stages upon which a high-stakes drama of power, wealth, and social manipulation unfolded. Capone, with his calculating gaze and signature charm, became the embodiment of this era, a man who could orchestrate supply chains spanning the city while simultaneously cultivating an image of sophistication, generosity, and celebrity, attending social events, hosting lavish dinners, occasionally making himself visible to the public in ways that blurred the lines between criminality and cultural prominence, a paradox that both fascinated and terrified the ordinary citizen who might pass by his establishments, unaware whether they were merely witnessing a social gathering or entering a carefully curated arena of influence, where a single misstep could carry consequences far beyond the personal. The rise of organized crime reshaped the very landscape of social life in urban America, because every speakeasy, every clandestine bar, and even the smallest hidden club existed within the shadow of these powerful syndicates, whose reach extended not only through the illegal alcohol trade, but into protection, enforcement, and, in many cases, political manipulation, creating an environment in which the exhilaration of nightlife was inextricably tied to a quiet awareness of danger, where the thrill of stepping into a hidden bar was accompanied by the unspoken understanding that you were entering a world ruled by both opportunity and intimidation, and where the most powerful figures could dictate not only who drank and danced, but who thrived, who survived, and who was quietly pushed aside. The law, in attempting to enforce morality, had unintentionally cultivated a society in which audacity, cunning, and social intelligence were as essential to participation in everyday leisure as the ability to dance or hold a conversation, and where the interplay between danger and delight created a cultural alchemy, transforming ordinary nights into charged, unforgettable experiences in which music, laughter, and rebellion were inseparable from the silent, ever-present hum of criminal enterprise humming just beneath the surface. It was within this volatile mix of freedom, risk, and enterprise that the Roaring Twenties truly came alive. For Americans were no longer merely consumers of leisure. They had become participants in a high-stakes social experiment, negotiating pleasure and peril in equal measure, navigating spaces where gangsters' influence lent both glamour and menace, and discovering that the pursuit of excitement in this decade could be as intoxicating and unpredictable as the very cocktails they raised to their lips, reminding all who wandered into these worlds that liberty in the 1920s was never free, but always thrilling, transformative, and irrevocably bound to the audacity of those bold enough to seize it. Inside the dimly lit speakeasies, where the scent of cigarette smoke mingled with the sharp, heady aroma of illegally brewed spirits, the atmosphere was charged with a tension that went far beyond the energetic pulse of jazz and the laughter of patrons. For these hidden establishments, while seemingly vibrant and carefree, were often governed by the quiet, unyielding authority of organized crime, where the sharp eyes of gangsters could transform a moment of revelry into a test of loyalty, composure, or even survival, and where the smallest missteps peaking too loudly, drawing unwanted attention, or inadvertently crossing the wrong person, might carry consequences that extended far beyond the immediate setting, rippling into the dangerous networks of influence, protection, and enforcement that allowed these criminal enterprises to thrive in a society that had outlawed their primary product. Every gesture, every whispered password, and every exchange at the bar became part of a carefully choreographed performance, a dance of discretion and daring, in which patrons were simultaneously participants in a social ritual and actors on a stage defined by risk, opportunity, and the unspoken rules imposed by those who controlled the liquor, the doors, and, by extension, the very mood of the room. The tension within these spaces was palpable, a constant undertone beneath the music and the laughter, and it created a strange alchemy in which danger and delight intertwined, amplifying the excitement of every encounter and heightening the sense of rebellion inherent in simply stepping inside. To drink, to dance, to flirt, or even just to witness the unfolding social spectacle was to participate in a silent acknowledgement that the rules of ordinary life no longer applied in these hidden realms, and that the authority of gangsters, with their tailored suits, calculating eyes, subtle gestures of power, was absolute, shaping the rhythm, the energy, and even the etiquette of the evening. Musicians, bartenders, and patrons alike understood that the speakeasy was a space where traditional hierarchies were inverted. While wealth and influence dictated behavior in the streets, above, inside, social navigation required equal measures of charm, awareness, and courage, and the very act of enjoying oneself became inseparable from the constant awareness that this pleasure existed precariously, on a knife edge, balance between exhilaration and peril. It is within this charged environment that the full impact of Prohibition's unintended consequences becomes clear. For speakeasies, far from being mere havens of amusement, were crucibles in which social experimentation, personal daring, cultural transformation were forged under the ever-present influence of organized crime, creating an atmosphere where exhilaration and menace were inseparable, where freedom and risk danced together as partners in a complex choreography, and where Americans came to understand, perhaps for the first time in their collective history, that the pursuit of leisure, pleasure, and personal expression could never be wholly divorced from the realities of power, danger, and human ingenuity, that the thrill of belonging to this secret world carried with it lessons about resilience, audacity, and the transformative force of daring to live beyond the ordinary. Amid the charged atmosphere of speakeasies, jazz halls, and the hidden corners of urban nightlife, another revolution was quietly unfolding, one that would reshape the very perception of gender, personal freedom, and cultural expression in America. 4 young women, inspired by the exhilaration of a decade that seemed determined to defy convention at every turn, began to embrace a new identity that was as visible as it was audacious, stepping into the public eye with bobbed hair, shorter skirts, grit, and dresses that shimmered and swayed with every confident step, signaling not merely a change in fashion, but a broader assertion of autonomy, creativity, and personal agency in a society that had long sought to define the boundaries of femininity with rigid Victorian-era expectations. These young women soon immortalized as flappers transformed the act of going out into a statement. Each movement on the dance floor, each flick of a wrist, and every daring smile conveying an unspoken manifesto of liberation, rebellion, and the right to exist visibly, audaciously, and unapologetically in public spaces that had once constrained them. And as they swirled through the crowded rooms, they were joined by an entire generation of men and women who were eager to witness, participate in, even emulate this new rhythm of life, creating an electric feedback loop of energy, style, and social experimentation that seemed to make the very walls of the city vibrate with possibility. The dances themselves, wild, unrestrained, and physically demanding, became a central expression of this newfound freedom, with steps like the Charleston, the Black Bottom, and other frenetic routines pushing the body beyond the confined, restrained movements that had dominated social dance for generations, and offering young women not only a form of entertainment, but a profound declaration of bodily autonomy, creativity, and social courage. For to dance in public, freely, and in the company of men on equal footing, was to participate in a subtle, yet unmistakable, subversion of deeply entrenched norms that had governed gender, behavior, and social interaction for decades. Each spinning skirt and synchronized kick of the feet became an act of personal and collective rebellion, a visible, kinetic manifestation of the changes sweeping through the cities, the countryside, and even suburban streets, where the rhythms of jazz, the roar of automobiles, and the subtle influence of cinema and mass media combined to cultivate a culture in which women's voices, bodies, and choices could finally occupy public space with authority and audacity. But the impact of flappers extended beyond fashion and dance. It was social, cultural, and profoundly transformative, for their presence challenged traditional courtship rituals, blurred the lines between public and private life, encouraged experimentation with new ideas, leisure activities, and modes of communication. From flirtatious conversation over a clandestine cocktail to engaging with literature, art, and music in ways that previously would have been considered inappropriate for women. And in doing so, they inspired their peers, intimidating conservative observers, and reshaped the very texture of social life, creating a decade in which freedom, expression, and audacity were no longer abstract ideals, but lived, visible, and contagious phenomena that defined the spirit of the Roaring Twenties. The music of the 1920s, a syncopated, wild, and electrifying jazz that seemed to embody the very heartbeat of a generation in motion, provided the perfect canvas for an extraordinary social experiment, one in which dance became far more than mere entertainment, evolving into a bold, kinetic declaration of freedom, creativity, and rebellion against the rigid, restrained, and painstakingly codified social norms of the Victorian era. For when flappers took to the dance floors of speakeasies, jazz halls, and private gatherings, their bodies in motion embodied a collective desire to reject the stifling proprieties that had dictated posture, gestures, and interactions for generations, and to instead inhabit a space defined by energy, spontaneity, and daring expression, where the feet, the arms, and the torso could articulate emotions, desires, and identities that had previously been constrained, if not entirely suppressed. Among these dances, the Charleston emerged as perhaps the most iconic, its rapid kicks, twisting steps, and flinging arms offering a visual manifesto of liberation, a celebration of the ability to move, to occupy space, and to be seen and heard in a society that had long told women to remain physically contained, socially restrained, and morally invisible. And yet, on these floors, the rules were inverted, if not entirely shattered, allowing men and women to engage in a playful, shared choreography that defied convention while simultaneously creating a new social language, a form of communication as immediate and visceral as the music itself, one that conveyed confidence, flirtation, exuberance, and a refusal to be limited by past expectations. The physicality of these dances was as revolutionary as their social implications, demanding endurance, coordination, and fearless expressiveness, qualities that challenged traditional notions of femininity and masculinity alike, while offering a rare public stage upon which young Americans could explore identity, creativity, and personal agency in real time. The pounding rhythms of jazz drums and the brassy cries of saxophones providing both a soundtrack and a structure within which energy, defiance, and liberation could flow freely, unimpeded by chaperones, propriety, or previous generations' rules. In this way, the Charleston, the Black Bottom, and other energetic dances became living symbols of a cultural rebellion, physical embodiments of a society negotiating new freedoms, and potent reminders that the pursuit of pleasure, individuality, and self-expression often requires stepping boldly into motion, into risk, and into spaces where every gesture, every spin, and every laugh carries meaning far beyond its immediate context. By the time the night wore on, and couples twisted and kicked, swung and spun in unison or playful improvisation, the floor itself seemed to pulse with the collective heartbeat of a generation, covering not only the joy of movement, but the exhilaration of autonomy, the thrill of shared experience, and the radical possibility that social conventions, long treated as immutable, could be rewritten, challenged, reimagined in real time, one step at a time. Beneath the electric glow of city lights, amidst the smoke and laughter, and to the irresistible call of jazz that would define an era, transforming ordinary evenings into unforgettable, liberating performances, and leaving all who participated with a profound sense that they were, in fact, dancing history itself. As the music faded and the final notes of a frenzied Charleston echoed through the speakeasy, the broader significance of the evening began to crystallize, revealing that the liberation expressed on the dance floor was merely one visible strand of a far-reaching cultural transformation, where the flappers, with their bold fashion choices, daring movements, and irrepressible confidence, were not simply claiming physical space, they were asserting intellectual, social, and political presence in ways that challenged the very foundations of American life, embodying the spirit of a generation that refused to be constrained by tradition, expectation, or the carefully prescribed roles of the past, and who understood, often instinctively, that visibility in public was inseparable from power, influence, and the ability to shape culture itself, in the streets, on streetcars, in coffee houses, and at political rallies. Women could now be seen engaging in conversations, debating ideas, and participating in activities that had once been exclusively male domains, their presence a tangible signal that the social landscape was changing irreversibly, and that public life was no longer a space reserved for men alone. While the hard-won victory of suffrage, achieved with the ratification of the 19th Amendment in 1920, provided not just the right to vote, but a symbolic, energizing validation of women's claims to authority, agency, and recognition in every sphere of society, from the workplace to the classroom, from leisure spaces to civic arenas. Flappers and their contemporaries carried this energy outward into fashion, literature, journalism, and activism, signaling that the playful defiance of social norms on a dance floor could coexist with, and even reinforce, serious engagement with political, cultural, and intellectual currents, demonstrating that liberation was not merely performative, but profoundly structural, affecting the ways Americans thought about gender, power, and community itself. The visible presence of women reshaped social rituals as well, influencing courtship, professional relationships, and even everyday interactions in public spaces, creating a dynamic tension between old expectations and new possibilities, where the act of walking confidently down a bustling street, entering a cafe unchaperoned, or attending a lecture or club meeting became a statement of independence, courage, and cultural assertion. A lived experience of change that reinforced the idea that the modern woman was no longer a passive observer of history, but an active participant in shaping it, blending audacity, intellect, and charm into a public persona that was at once compelling, inspiring, and undeniably transformative. In this way, the increased visibility of women in public and political life during the 1920s was not a mere footnote to history, but a defining feature of the decade, a reflection of a society in flux, and a signal that the personal freedoms so vividly celebrated on the dance floors and in the hidden corners of speakeasies were intimately connected to broader societal shifts, reminding all who observed, participated, or simply watched from the sidelines that liberation was both an individual journey and a collective project, one in which fashion, dance, and public presence intertwined seamlessly with politics, culture, and the evolving identity of a nation daring to redefine itself. As the city's streets hummed with electricity and the speakeasies continued to pulse with jazz, laughter, and whispered secrets, another, even more unusual form of leisure began to captivate the imaginations of Americans hungry for excitement, recognition, and the thrill of testing human endurance, the dance marathon, a phenomenon that transformed ordinary evenings into spectacles of stamina, willpower, and spectacle, where couples would glide, shuffle, and spin for hours, days, and even weeks on end. Each movement a testament to determination, grit, and the intoxicating allure of competition, all under the watchful eyes of onlookers who cheered, marveled, and occasionally gasped at the sheer physical audacity on display. These contests, often staged in vast halls or repurposed theaters, drew young men and women from every corner of the city. Many motivated not only by the promise of a substantial cash prize, sometimes equivalent to several months' wages for the average worker, but also by the intangible rewards of fame, social recognition, and the exhilarating sense of participating in something extraordinary. An event that blurred the lines between sport, performance, and social spectacle in ways that had never been seen before. The rules were deceptively simple. Participants were required to keep moving, rarely stopping, while observers, judges, and event organizers imposed strict routines punctuated only by brief breaks, allowing the dancers to rest, eat, or recover for a mere 15 minutes before being thrust back into motion, creating a rhythm of endurance and performance that tested both the body and the mind, and transformed the very act of dancing into a narrative of struggle, triumph, and human resilience. Yet the spectacle extended beyond the floor, for the audience became an integral part of the drama, cheering every feint, twist, and stumble, celebrating moments of brilliance, and expressing empathy for exhaustion, weaving together a collective experience in which spectators and participants were inextricably linked, united by the tension, excitement, and joy that only such a high-stakes public display could generate. What made these marathons so emblematic of the 1920s was not merely the novelty or the endurance involved, but the way they reflected broader cultural currents, the desire to push boundaries, to embrace risk, and to find liberation in the shared experience of struggle and exhilaration, all while participating in a public ritual that was both intensely personal and socially performative. The dancers, many of them young women, asserting independence and agency, navigated exhaustion with grace and determination, their movements serving as metaphors for the transformative spirit of the decade itself, in which limits were tested, social hierarchies challenged, and ordinary life expanded into extraordinary spectacle. In this sense, dance marathons were more than competitions. They were living embodiments of a society redefining leisure, pleasure, and endurance, demonstrating that the pursuit of excitement, recognition, and human expression could exist at the intersection of physical daring, cultural rebellion, and the irresistible thrill of public attention, leaving everyone involved, whether on the floor or in the crowd, with a profound sense that life itself had become an arena in which energy, creativity, and audacity were not only celebrated but essential to the pursuit of modern identity and fulfillment. While the dance marathons and speakeasies drew crowds seeking the thrill of public spectacle, another quieter, yet equally transformative revolution in leisure was taking place within the private walls of homes, were the invention and popularization of phonographs, along with the creative energy of house parties, allowed Americans to curate their own social experiences, blending music, conversation, and intimate celebration in ways that were previously unimaginable, and transforming ordinary living rooms, parlors, and dining rooms into vibrant spaces of cultural experimentation, social connection, and personal expression, where the rhythm of jazz, blues, and popular dance tunes could fill the air at any hour, unrestrained by the schedules, rules, or physical limitations of public venues. The phonograph, a technological marvel of the era, became the centerpiece of these gatherings, a magical device capable of delivering the latest hits from Chicago, New York, or New Orleans directly into the home, offering a sensory experience that could rival even the most extravagant nightclub, and allowing hosts to orchestrate evenings that were at once social, artistic, and playful, with friends gathering around to listen, dance, or simply revel in the shared intimacy of music experienced collectively, yet controlled entirely by those within the room, free from the intrusion of outsiders or the prying eyes of authority, and empowered to explore new dances, experiment with flirtation, or simply let themselves be carried away by the sounds of a saxophone, the pulse of a drum, or the seductive croon of a singer emanating from a small, elegant box perched upon a sideboard. House parties, often informal and spontaneous, became laboratories of social creativity, offering participants opportunities to test new ideas, gestures, and interactions in a private, yet communal setting, and enabling Americans to explore a level of autonomy over leisure and entertainment that was unprecedented in their history, also democratizing access to cultural experiences that had previously required expensive tickets, social connections, or travel to urban centers. Suddenly, the pleasures of jazz, the excitement of dance, and the intimacy of shared amusement were available to anyone with a phonograph, a modest gathering of friends, and a willingness to embrace novelty and fun. In this environment, music, conversation, and the rhythms of social experimentation intertwined seamlessly, creating a new form of participation in modern life, one that blurred the boundaries between public spectacle and private enjoyment, between individual expression and collective experience, and between tradition and innovation, leaving Americans with a thrilling sense that leisure, like freedom itself, could be curated, expanded, and personalized in ways that reflected the spirit, audacity, and creativity of the roaring decade. Even beyond the walls of the home, these innovations rippled outward, influencing fashion, dance, and popular taste. As individuals who had discovered the joys of private musical gatherings brought new moves, new songs, and new styles into public spaces, creating a feedback loop in which home entertainment not only satisfied immediate desires for fun and intimacy, but also helped to shape broader cultural currents, reinforcing the idea that the 1920s were not just defined by public spectacles of excess, but equally by the quiet, ingenious, and deeply human desire to create moments of joy, connection, and self-expression wherever and whenever opportunity allowed. Beyond the cozy intimacy of house parties and phonograph-fueled gatherings, the streets and cityscapes of the 1920s pulsed with a different kind of energy, one that drew people outward into spaces of collective excitement, shared spectacle, and communal ritual for public events, from roaring baseball games under floodlights to the late-night bustle of diners open to the early hours offered Americans a sense of connection that transcended neighborhood, class, and even regional differences, allowing citizens to inhabit a shared cultural rhythm while simultaneously witnessing the evolving spirit of a nation in motion, energized by its newfound mobility, optimism, and appetite for entertainment. The baseball stadium, for instance, was no longer merely a field for athletic competition. It had become a grand stage for the spectacle of human endeavor, where players like Babe Ruth transcended sport to become symbols of audacity, charisma, and possibility, and where thousands of spectators, standing shoulder to shoulder in bleachers, gasped, cheered, and collectively marveled at feats of power, speed, and daring that seemed to embody the very heartbeat of the decade itself, turning ordinary afternoons into communal celebrations of ambition, risk, and spectacle. Similarly, all-night diners, with their neon signs glowing like beacons against the darkened city streets, offered a different, yet equally powerful, form of social cohesion, providing spaces where young men and women, workers and students, artists and laborers could congregate, converse, and forge connections well beyond the rigid schedules and hierarchies of daytime life. The clatter of dishes, the hiss of coffee machines, and the low hum of conversation, creating a soundtrack that was uniquely urban, intimate, and democratic, and where the sharing of food, laughter, stories became both a ritual and a reprieve, a way to claim a small but meaningful space within the sprawling, electrified cityscape. In these spaces, friendships were formed, romances sparked, and communities coalesced, all under the soft glow of gas lamps, the flicker of neon, and the constant undercurrent of jazz, blues, and popular tunes that seemed to follow people wherever they went, linking private pleasure with public engagement, individual curiosity with collective identity, and fleeting moments of joy with lasting memories of participation in a shared cultural heartbeat. These communal experiences, whether in the stadium, at the diner, or in informal gatherings on street corners and parks, were more than mere diversions. They were vital social laboratories, revealing the ways in which Americans were learning to negotiate freedom, entertainment, and social cohesion in a rapidly changing world, where technology, leisure, and mobility offered new opportunities to connect, observe, and participate in the creation of a national identity defined as much by its audacity and energy as by its ordinary human desire to gather, celebrate, and witness the unfolding spectacle of life together. In this way, the public spaces of sport and nightlife became arenas not only for play and pleasure, but for the shared enactment of a culture in transition, reminding participants that belonging, excitement, and memory are always amplified when experienced collectively, and that the 1920s were a decade in which the pulse of the crowd, the laughter of strangers, and the thrill of communal participation were inseparable from the exhilaration of being alive in a world that seemed perpetually poised on the edge of possibility. As the roar of crowds at ballparks and arenas echoed through the streets, another remarkable phenomenon emerged in the 1920s, one that transformed ordinary sports into cultural spectacles and ordinary athletes into larger-than-life figures whose fame extended far beyond the boundaries of the playing field, capturing the imagination of an entire nation and reshaping the very concept of celebrity. For players like Babe Ruth, with his towering home runs and exuberant personality, became more than just baseball stars. They became symbols of a new, daring America, exuberant, bold, and unconstrained by the traditions of the past. Their exploits chronicled in newspapers, magazines, and newsreels, reaching audiences in urban centers, small towns, and rural communities alike, and creating a shared cultural vocabulary in which admiration, aspiration, and astonishment were intertwined. Babe Ruth's presence was electric, a force that drew thousands into stadiums where fans, young and old, would hold their breath in unison as he stepped to the plate, a larger-than-life figure whose confidence and flamboyance seemed to embody the spirit of a nation eager to define itself through spectacle, achievement, and charisma, while Jack Dempsey, the Manasseh Mauler, brought similar excitement to the boxing ring. His aggressive, relentless style transforming the sport into a theater of intensity, endurance, and raw human drama, and capturing the fascination of audiences who craved both the thrill of competition and the narrative of triumph, struggle, and personal audacity that these athletes so vividly embodied. In a time before television, radio broadcasts, newspapers, and newsreels became the conduits through which fans experienced not only the games themselves, but also the personalities, quirks, and private lives of these heroes. creating a new form of intimacy between the public and their idols, and elevating athletic achievement to the status of cultural mythology, in which home runs, knockouts, and daring feats were celebrated as collective experiences, shaping conversations, social interactions, and even aspirations across communities. What made Ruth, Dempsey, and their contemporaries so transformative was not merely their athletic skill, but their ability to transcend the rules of the sport and become symbols of possibility, audacity, and individuality, reflecting broader cultural shifts in which fame, performance, and public recognition were increasingly intertwined, and where ordinary Americans could look to these figures not just as entertainers, but as embodiments of energy, risk-taking, and the exhilaration of a life unafraid to push boundaries, seize opportunity, and capture the attention of a nation eager to embrace heroes who were vivid, dynamic, and utterly modern. Their celebrity also reinforced the interconnectedness of leisure, media, and identity, demonstrating that in the roaring 20s, public fascination, communal excitement, personal aspiration were inseparable threads woven into the larger tapestry of a society experiencing profound transformation, where the spectacle of sport became both a mirror and a catalyst for the ambitions, joys, and shared experiences of everyday Americans navigating a rapidly changing world filled with possibility, success, and the unmistakable thrill of collective wonder. As the roar of individual athletes like Babe Ruth and Jack Dempsey electrified the imagination of the public, the broader phenomena of major sporting events transformed cities into arenas of collective fascination, drawing tens of thousands of spectators who pressed into grandstands, crowded sidewalks, and surrounding streets, their anticipation and excitement palpable, their voices rising and falling like waves in response to every swing, punch, or sprint, creating an atmosphere that was as much a social experience as it was a sporting contest, a shared ritual in which the thrill of competition, the spectacle of human skill, and the exhilaration of being part of something larger than oneself coalesced into a communal heartbeat that pulsed through every corner of the city. These events, championship boxing matches, World Series, baseball games, and marathon tennis competitions, were not merely athletic contests, but cultural landmarks, carefully chronicled by the rapidly evolving media landscape, which included newspapers with expansive sports sections, early radio broadcasts that allowed fans to follow every play or round in near real time, and newsreels that brought moving images of heroic performances and dramatic upsets to theaters across the country, providing a visual and auditory connection that amplified the excitement far beyond the stadium itself. The emerging media did more than report results. It created narratives, personalities, and mythologies, turning athletes into national icons whose actions were scrutinized, celebrated, and endlessly discussed in parlors, diners, and workplace lunchrooms alike, forging a sense of shared experience and collective memory among people who might never meet, but could thrill together at the exploits of their heroes, gasp at the drama of a last-minute play, or marvel at the sheer audacity of a knockout punch or home run that defied expectation. Even those who could not attend in person were drawn into the spectacle, imagining the roar of the crowd, the tension in the stadium, and the exhilaration of witnessing greatness, while newspapers and radio broadcasts competed to provide the most vivid, immediate, and captivating accounts, blending meticulous reporting with a flair for drama that turned every play into a story, every victory into a moral lesson, and every defeat into a moment of collective heartbreak and empathy, reinforcing the idea that sports in the 1920s were as much about community, identity, and cultural connection as they were about physical prowess. These gatherings were also social barometers, revealing the intersections of class, race, gender, and geography, as fans from different walks of life came together to participate in the collective energy of a shared cultural moment, with the emerging media acting as both conduit and amplifier, connecting urban and rural audiences, first-time spectators, and lifelong fans, and creating a national conversation in which the pulse of sporting events became inseparable from the pulse of the country itself. A rhythmic celebration of ambition, spectacle, and the transformative power of collective human experience, and a testament to the ways in which entertainment, technology, and social imagination could converge to make ordinary moments extraordinary, leaving every participant, reader, or listener with a profound sense of belonging to a world in which possibility, energy, and cultural identity were defined as much by public spectacle as by private experience. As the crowds cheered for athletes and danced in city halls, another form of spectacle quietly captivated the nation, one that transported viewers far beyond the stadium, the diner, or the speakeasy, and into worlds, both real and imagined, the cinema, a burgeoning medium in which silent films reigned supreme, combining the artistry of moving pictures with the immediacy of contemporary news, the charm of fiction, and the irresistible allure of celebrity gossip, all delivered to audiences who flocked to grand theaters with ornate facades, velvet seats, and gilded balconies, eager to be swept away into the flickering shadows on the screen, to experience the thrill of adventure, romance, and human drama in a communal yet intensely personal way. The newsreels, shown before feature films, brought distant events into sharp focus for Americans who might never leave their towns, capturing the dedication of presidents, the devastation of famine abroad, or the triumphs and scandals of high society. Their images accompanied by organ music or a narrator's voice in the theater, creating an intimacy and immediacy that made viewers feel connected to the broader world, while also reinforcing a shared sense of civic awareness, curiosity, and cultural engagement. Alongside these factual accounts, fictional stories unfolded with sweeping drama. From daring escapes and romantic entanglements to epic adventures that spanned continents, captivating audiences with visual storytelling that transcended language and social barriers, allowing men and women, rich and poor, city dwellers and rural visitors alike to lose themselves in narratives that thrilled, inspired, and provoked reflection, while subtly reinforcing contemporary social ideals, anxieties, and fantasies. From the possibilities of love and personal reinvention to the tensions of morality and modernity, interspersed with these stories, glimpses into the lives of stars Mary Pickford, Rudolph Valentino, Douglas Fairbanks, and others turned ordinary actors into icons whose faces, fashions, and mannerisms were emulated across the country. Their personalities dissected in fan magazines and newspaper columns, creating a new form of celebrity culture that extended beyond talent into lifestyle, aspiration, and the intimate rituals of everyday life. Patrons left the theater carrying not only the images and emotions of the films themselves, but also the subtle cues, fashions, and behaviors of those they admired on screen, blending admiration, imitation, and aspiration into the fabric of daily existence and reinforcing cinema as a powerful agent of cultural transmission and social imagination. The experience of silent films was immersive and communal, yet deeply interactive, as audiences responded with laughter, applause, gasps, or even collective sighs at climactic moments, transforming the theater into a space of shared emotion, reflection, and participation, and allowing cinema to serve as a mirror and amplifier of the era's cultural, social, and aesthetic transformations, reflecting the hopes, fears, and desires of a generation navigating the dizzying changes of the 1920s. From technological innovation to shifting gender roles and new modes of entertainment. In this way, the cinema, with its silent storytelling, newsreels, and celebrity fascination, was not merely a pastime, but a vital lens through which Americans understood themselves, each other, and the rapidly evolving world around them. A medium that bridged private imagination and public consciousness, blending fantasy, fact, and cultural aspiration into an experience that was as modern as it was enduring, and as electrifying in the flicker of a projector as any spectacle on the streets, dance halls, or stadiums of the decade. Beyond the glow of the silver screen and the immersive pull of silent films, a new phenomenon was reshaping the way Americans saw themselves, each other, and the possibilities of daily life. The rise of movie stars as household names, figures whose influence extended far beyond their roles in fiction and into the very fabric of culture, fashion, and lifestyle, turning the imagined glamour of Hollywood into tangible aspirations for millions of viewers across the nation, who eagerly mimicked their hairstyles, clothing, mannerisms, and even modes of speech, translating the allure of the theater into the rhythm of their own everyday routines. Mary Pickford's delicate charm, Rudolph Valentino's magnetic presence, and Douglas Fairbanks' daring physicality became more than mere entertainment. They were templates for behavior, symbols of success, romance, and sophistication, offering audiences a way to participate imaginatively in a world of elegance, adventure, and social possibility that might otherwise have been completely out of reach, and yet somehow felt attainable through imitation, aspiration, and personal expression. Fans did not simply admire from afar, they actively absorbed, adapted, and reinterpreted these icons into the textures of their lives. Whether by adopting a Valentino-inspired, slick-back hairstyle, attending dance parties in dresses modeled after Pickford's delicate silhouettes, or even infusing their social interactions with the bravado and physicality of Fairbanks' swashbuckling persona, effectively blurring the line between fiction and reality, between fantasy and lived experience, and allowing cinematic culture to permeate not only individual identity, but also the collective imagination of towns, neighborhoods, and urban centers across the country. Magazines, newspapers, and early fan clubs amplified this effect, delivering intimate glimpses of stars' lifestyles, fashion choices, and private rituals directly into homes, cultivating a sense of connection, familiarity, and even personal participation in a glamorous, aspirational world, while simultaneously democratizing access to trends and ideas that had once been the exclusive domain of the wealthy or socially elite. In this way, the cultural power of movie stars extended far beyond the theater, creating a feedback loop in which the desires, behaviors, and aesthetics of the screen were integrated into real-life social environments, influencing how people dressed for parties, how they styled their hair for photographs, how they moved across dance floors, and even how they expressed themselves in the rhythms of conversation and courtship. The stars became touchstones for identity, markers of taste and social awareness, and, in many ways, living symbols of the new freedoms, possibilities, and aspirations that defined the Roaring '20s, where the intersection of technology, media, and imagination allowed ordinary Americans to participate in a shared cultural moment that was at once thrilling, aspirational, and profoundly unifying, reminding every spectator that in this era, the experience of watching, admiring, and imitating could itself be a transformative act, shaping both individual expression and collective culture in ways that remain deeply resonant to this day. While Hollywood stars captured the hearts and imaginations of millions of Americans, the cinematic landscape of the 1920s was not limited to domestic productions alone. For European films and their daring artistic innovations began crossing the Atlantic, offering audiences a glimpse into worlds that were stylistically, thematically, and emotionally distinct from the more familiar fare of American studios, and in doing so, they expanded the horizons of cultural exposure, aesthetic appreciation, and intellectual engagement for viewers willing to venture beyond the predictable narratives of homegrown entertainment, allowing the imagination to wander through the shadowed, expressionistic sets of German cinema, the poetic and experimental storytelling of French directors, and the psychological sophistication of Scandinavian productions. Films such as Nosferatu, an unofficial adaptation of Bram Stoker's Dracula, introduced American audiences to Gothic atmospheres, stark contrasts of light and shadow, and a visual vocabulary that conveyed fear, tension, and human vulnerability in ways that words alone could not. creating a cinematic experience that was simultaneously thrilling, unsettling, and intellectually stimulating, and encouraging a deeper recognition that film could function not merely as amusement, but as art, a medium capable of evoking complex emotional landscapes and engaging viewers in aesthetic contemplation. These imports did more than entertain. They challenged American filmmakers, critics, and audiences to reconsider narrative structure, lighting, set design, and performance, fostering a dialogue between continents in which stylistic experimentation and thematic boldness pushed the boundaries of what cinema could represent and how it could affect its audience, while also cultivating a more cosmopolitan understanding of culture among viewers. We might never travel to Europe, but could experience its artistic pulse in the darkened glow of a theater. The contrast between European and American filmmaking styles illuminated differing cultural priorities, with European directors often emphasizing psychological depth, symbolism, and moral ambiguity, while American productions leaned toward spectacle, heroism, and romanticized narratives, creating a rich tension that inspired innovation, imitation, and critical discussion, and encouraging Americans to see their own society through a more nuanced, multifaceted lens. For audiences sitting in the gilded theaters of New York, Chicago, and Los Angeles, the experience of European cinema was a kind of cultural awakening, where the flicker of the projector became a portal into the unfamiliar, the experimental, and the transformative, allowing spectators to grapple with ideas, emotions, and visual strategies that challenged conventional expectations and expanded the very definition of entertainment, showing that cinema could be simultaneously thrilling, instructive, and provocative. One day not only into foreign lands, but also into the evolving capacities of human creativity, imagination, and expression, and cementing the 1920s as a decade in which Americans were increasingly able to engage with, interpret, and incorporate a wider range of artistic and cultural influences into the rhythms, tastes, and aspirations of their own daily lives. As the flickering images of cinema expanded Americans' cultural horizons and introduced them to new artistic sensibilities, another technological marvel was quietly transforming the very way people experienced music, storytelling, and communal engagement within the intimate spaces of their homes. The radio, a device that, with its invisible waves, bridged distances and connected households across cities, towns, and rural landscapes in a way that had previously been unimaginable, turning the ordinary living room into a site of shared excitement, anticipation, and discovery, and transforming private moments into collective experiences as families gathered around a single set, listening together to music, news, drama, and comedy that was broadcast simultaneously to countless others across the nation. In the 1920s, the radio was more than a convenience. It was a revolution in access, creating a democratization of culture that allowed Americans of all backgrounds to participate in the rhythms, occasions, and amusements of the era, whether by tuning in to the latest jazz broadcasts that had once been confined to smoky dance halls, following the suspense of serialized radio dramas that brought intrigue and romance to suburban parlors, or laughing along with comedians whose wit crossed social and regional boundaries, fostering a sense of shared humor, tension, and emotional resonance. Unlike cinema, which required a trip to the theater, or live sporting events, which demanded physical presence, the radio dissolved barriers of distance, time, and mobility, allowing listeners to inhabit the same cultural moment as millions of others without leaving their homes, forging a collective consciousness in which the national pulse of music, entertainment, and news could be felt in every household, binding disparate communities together through the invisible thread of shared sound. The impact of radio was also deeply social, influencing how people spent their leisure hours, structured their evenings, and conceived of entertainment itself, as listening became an event around which families and friends congregated, often accompanied by conversation, debate, or spontaneous imitation of the voices and performances emanating from the set, and creating a participatory culture that blended imagination, observation, and connection in ways that were entirely new, making ordinary routines like preparing dinner, relaxing after work, or entertaining guests into opportunities for engagement with the wider world. Furthermore, the radio amplified trends in music and performance, broadcasting the latest jazz, blues, and popular songs into living rooms far removed from city clubs, allowing styles, dances, and fashions to spread rapidly across regions, and cultivating a sense of cohesion in a society that was increasingly mobile, urbanized, and interconnected, where the sounds coming from a single device could simultaneously entertain, inform, and unify, transforming leisure from a private indulgence into a shared, culturally significant experience that both reflected and shaped the collective imagination of a rapidly modernizing America. Just as radio waves carried music and drama into living rooms, quietly reshaping the rhythms of daily life. Another innovation, far more tangible and kinetic, was radically altering the physical landscape of American leisure, freedom, and domestic existence. The automobile, a symbol of speed, independence, and possibility that transformed not only how people moved from place to place, but also where they lived, how they socialized, and what it meant to experience the country itself, turning travel into an adventure, neighborhoods into sprawling, core-oriented communities, and weekends into opportunities for exploration that had previously been the exclusive privilege of the wealthy. In the early 1920s, stepping into a car meant stepping into a new dimension of freedom. The constraints of public transportation, horse-drawn vehicles, and fixed schedules began to dissolve as families, couples, and young adventurers discovered that a trunk filled with provisions, a carefully packed picnic basket, and an open road could transport them hundreds of miles away from the confines of the city, through rolling fields, small towns, and forests, all at a pace that combined the exhilaration of speed with the intimacy of close observation, allowing travelers to see, hear, and smell the countryside in a way that train windows, streetcars, or carriages could never provide. The impact of automobiles extended far beyond travel itself, reshaping residential patterns as cities and towns began to spread outward along roadways rather than clustering tightly around transit lines, giving rise to suburban developments that prioritized wide streets, private garages, and easy access to major thoroughfares, while fostering a lifestyle in which the car was not simply a tool for mobility, but a central feature of daily existence, social identity, and recreational planning. Families used automobiles for weekend excursions to lakes, parks, and seaside resorts, transforming ordinary landscapes into spaces of leisure and adventure, while young couples discovered newfound privacy and autonomy on long drives, reconfiguring courtship rituals and social norms in subtle yet profound ways. Auto camping emerged as a popular practice, with families or friends carrying tents, food, and supplies in their trunks, setting up makeshift bases in scenic areas, turning the act of travel itself into a form of entertainment, physical activity, and bonding, merging the joys of nature with the thrills of technological mobility. Even small businesses, roadside diners, and local attractions felt the transformative power of the automobile as entrepreneurs like Joe, who started with a modest sandwich stand, witnessed their customer base expand exponentially, drawing visitors from miles around who were no longer limited by walking distance or trolley schedules, and creating a vibrant, car-driven economy that linked mobility, leisure, and social experience in unprecedented ways. The automobile did not merely facilitate recreation, it created it, enabling Americans to define leisure on their own terms, to chart routes according to curiosity rather than convention, and to experience both urban and rural spaces as flexible stages for social interaction, adventure, and personal exploration, encapsulating the restless energy, ambition, desire for autonomy that characterized the Roaring Twenties, and leaving an enduring imprint on the very way Americans understood freedom, pleasure, and the possibilities of everyday life. Before the roar of engines and the hum of tires on open highways became a familiar soundtrack to American life, travel had largely been the privilege of the affluent, reserved for those who could afford long train journeys, luxury steamship voyages, stays in grand hotels that punctuated the rail lines stretching across the country, leaving the middle and working classes to dream of distant landscapes while their daily lives remained confined to the familiar routines of town, factory, or farm. Yet, the automobile, with its promise of mobility, independence, and self-directed adventure, revolutionized this reality, opening the doors of exploration to a much broader swath of the population, allowing families, friends, and couples who had never previously considered travel beyond their immediate neighborhoods to chart their own courses, pack their provisions into trunks, and set off toward the horizon at their own pace, discovering rivers, forests, small towns, and coastal stretches as if they had suddenly been granted access to a world previously hidden behind the curtain of wealth and social exclusivity. Auto camping, in particular, became a defining expression of this democratization, transforming the very nature of leisure into a hands-on, participatory experience, where families would convert their vehicles into mobile bases, carrying tents, foldable chairs, food, and recreational equipment, and establishing temporary campsites beside lakes, fields, or forest paths where parents could instruct children in outdoor skills. Fathers could teach the intricacies of skipping stones across still waters. Mothers could orchestrate elaborate picnics on blankets spread under the open sky, and young couples could retreat to quieter corners, blending social intimacy with the liberating sense of being away from the watchful eyes and social restrictions of the city. This practice not only gave ordinary Americans access to experiences that had been, until recently, the province of the wealthy, but it also fostered a profound sense of agency, adventure, and self-determination, allowing travelers to dictate the rhythm of their journey, select their destinations, craft narratives of personal exploration and collective memory that were uniquely their own, all while embracing the exhilaration of movement, the beauty of natural landscapes, and the playful, improvisational nature of life on the road. The automobile thus became more than a machine. It was a vessel of freedom, an instrument through which Americans could participate in the physical and cultural pleasures of mobility that had once been reserved for elite society, flattening social hierarchies in subtle but meaningful ways and embedding the ideals of exploration, independence, and shared experience into the everyday imagination of a nation. And his families, friends, and young adventurers rolled down highways and winding country roads. They were not merely traveling, they were collectively redefining what it meant to experience the vast, varied, and rapidly modernizing landscapes of the United States, democratizing not only movement, but also leisure, social engagement, and the very concept of possibility in the era of the Roaring Twenties, as automobiles carried Americans farther from city centers and democratized access to landscapes once reserved for the wealthy. Another transformation was quietly reshaping the urban and suburban experience in ways that touched the very rhythm of daily life, casting cities, towns, and neighborhoods in an entirely new light, quite literally through the proliferation of electric lighting, which extended the boundaries of activity well beyond the setting sun and enabled an after-dark culture that was as vibrant, varied, and alive as the daytime economy had ever been, turning streets, sidewalks, storefronts, theaters, and parks into illuminated stages upon which the excitement, curiosity, and social energy of the Roaring Twenties could play out without interruption. The introduction of widespread electric illumination allowed shopkeepers to keep windows glowing late into the evening, enticing passersby with displays of fashion, novelty goods, and the latest technologies, while theaters and concert halls used dazzling arrays of lights to draw audiences into performances that might have previously been impossible after sunset, creating a nocturnal landscape in which the city pulsed with life and activity, challenging conventional rhythms of work, leisure, and family routines, and fostering a sense of continuous motion, possibility, and discovery that captivated both residents and visitors alike. Restaurants, diners, and stayed open later than ever before, transforming casual meals into social events and creating spaces where friends, colleagues, and strangers could gather to converse, celebrate, or simply observe the lively interplay of humanity under glowing lamplight, while streets themselves became arenas of spectacle, filled with illuminated shop signs, the gleam of polished automobiles, and the animated movements of pedestrians, dancers, and young people eager to explore, flirt, and participate in the shared cultural currents that electrified the air. In suburban neighborhoods, electric lighting similarly altered the sense of possibility, enabling households to host evening gatherings, display gardens, or home decorations for passersby, and participate in cultural activities that once required travel into the heart of the city, effectively narrowing the gap between urban and suburban experience and fostering a sense of connectedness, curiosity, and engagement with modern life that transcended geographic boundaries. The night, once a domain defined by rest, domestic confinement, or caution, it became a canvas for exploration, social experimentation, and performance, reflecting and reinforcing broader social changes, including the growing visibility of women in public spaces, the expansion of leisure as a socially recognized pursuit, and the blending of entertainment, commerce, and communal interaction into a continuous flow of cultural vitality. Electric lighting did more than illuminate streets and rooms. It illuminated the imagination, extending the temporal and spatial boundaries of modern American life and allowing individuals, families, and communities to inhabit a world in which activity, curiosity, and social connection were no longer constrained by natural cycles, and where the interplay of technology, culture, and human desire created a vibrant, dynamic, and profoundly transformative urban and suburban experience, one in which the promise of the evening was as full of possibility, excitement, and discovery as the day that had preceded it, signaling the emergence of a society increasingly defined by movement, choice, and the relentless pursuit of new pleasures, connections, and experiences. As electric lighting extended the hours of activity and automobiles expanded the reach of daily life, a new kind of community began to take shape on the outskirts of America's bustling urban centers, the planned suburb, carefully designed from the ground up to accommodate the rhythms, conveniences, and possibilities of automobile-oriented living, reflecting a profound shift in both the physical and social landscape, and offering families a level of comfort, freedom, and recreational opportunity that was unprecedented in earlier generations. These neighborhoods were not merely clusters of houses along existing roads, They were thoughtfully constructed environments featuring wide, tree-lined streets that encouraged leisurely drives, larger lots that allowed for gardens, patios, and yards where children could play freely, and garages integrated into home designs to house the increasingly indispensable automobile, signaling a reimagining of domestic space that blended mobility, convenience, and the promise of modern leisure. Within these planned suburbs, family life evolved alongside technological and social innovations, creating opportunities for recreation and interaction that had previously been constrained by crowded city conditions, limited access to public parks, or the rigid schedules imposed by industrialized work and urban transit systems. Weekends could be devoted to long drives along winding roads, picnics at nearby lakes or forests, and spontaneous excursions that blended the excitement of travel with the intimacy of home-centered leisure. Evenings might be spent listening to the radio, hosting house guests, or exploring the illuminated streets and of nearby towns, allowing families to participate in both private and public spheres of enjoyment, without leaving the comfort and safety of their suburban environment. These communities fostered a sense of autonomy, experimentation, and collective identity, where neighbors could gather for social events, children could explore their surroundings with relative independence, and adults could pursue hobbies, cultural interests, and entertainment in ways that blended the domestic with the communal, reflecting the broader cultural transformations of the 1920s in which leisure, mobility, and social connection were increasingly intertwined. Planned suburbs also exemplified the democratizing potential of automobile culture, demonstrating how access to technology, its infrastructure, and modern design could create new avenues for everyday exploration, recreation, and social engagement, and how the layout of space itself could influence the rhythms of life, enabling a generation to inhabit a world where travel, leisure, and community were no longer dictated by proximity to a city center or the limitations of foot, horse, or trolley transportation. In this way, the suburbs of the 1920s were both a product and a catalyst of the era. Extraordinary transformations, offering families a carefully orchestrated environment in which the pleasures of modernity, from casual drives to landscaped gardens, from evening gatherings to community celebrations, could be seamlessly integrated into daily life, creating a living laboratory for the negotiation of freedom, entertainment, socialization, and cultural aspiration that would define much of mid-century American identity, while illustrating how technology, planning, and imagination combined to reshape not just where people lived, but how they experienced, interacted with, and ultimately celebrated the possibilities of their own lives. As suburbs spread outward and families settled into their automobile-oriented homes, the restless energy of the Roaring Twenties found countless inventive outlets, manifesting not only in music, cinema, and urban nightlife, but also in a series of spectacles and endurance contests that captured the collective imagination of the American public and transformed leisure into a daring form of public performance. Dance marathons, for example, emerged as both a thrilling test of stamina and a social phenomena that blurred the boundaries between recreation, competition, and entertainment, where couples would glide, shuffle, and whirl across wooden floors for hours, sometimes days, punctuated only by brief, regimented breaks, all in pursuit of modest monetary prizes that for ordinary Americans represented months of wages, and in doing so, creating a shared culture of fascination, empathy, and vicarious excitement for spectators who lined the edges of the dance halls to watch exhaustion, determination, and exuberance unfold in real time. The contests were at once grueling and exhilarating, combining the allure of novelty, the spectacle of human endurance, and the thrill of rebellion against conventional notions of propriety, turning ordinary citizens into both participants and witnesses of feats that were as psychologically intense as they were physically demanding, and infusing a sense of immediacy, drama, and emotional engagement into the very concept of leisure. Meanwhile, even more peculiar spectacles, such as flagpole sitting, captured headlines and public attention with a combination of absurdity, daring, and the human fascination with extremes. Individuals would perch atop flagpoles for days, weeks, or even months, enduring wind, rain, sun, and isolation, turning endurance itself into performance art and creating a spectacle that both amused and inspired. As crowds gathered to witness these audacious acts, while imagining themselves in a precarious balance between boredom, fear, and triumph, such phenomena were emblematic of a decade in which ordinary routines and pastimes were being reimagined, where the search for excitement, novelty, and social distinction drove people to experiment with forms of leisure that tested the limits of body and mind, while simultaneously fostering a collective culture of storytelling, gossip, and admiration that spanned neighborhoods, cities, and regions, and in doing so, blurred the line between private amusement and public spectacle in ways that were uniquely emblematic of the 1920s. These endurance contests and fads, however eccentric they may appear today, were more than just curiosities. They reflected the decade's profound fascination with vitality, modernity, and the democratization of experience, demonstrating how Americans increasingly sought to define pleasure on their own terms. challenge social conventions, and cultivate shared moments of wonder, astonishment, and delight. Whether in the glow of urban electric lights, at the edges of suburban lawns, or atop a precarious flagpole with the horizon stretching endlessly beneath them, participants and spectators alike were part of a cultural experiment in freedom, endurance, and community engagement, embodying the restless inventiveness, audacity, optimism that characterized an era in which leisure, entertainment, and human ambition intersected in exhilarating, unexpected, and often unforgettable ways. As the 1920s unfolded with the relentless hum of automobiles, the electric glow of city streets, and the thrill of spectacles like dance marathons and flagpole sitting, Americans increasingly discovered that leisure and social life could serve not merely as relaxation, but as a stage for experimentation, self-expression, and the negotiation of new social norms, challenging traditions that had long governed behavior, propriety, and interaction across age, gender, and class. In homes, neighborhoods, and urban centers alike, people tested the boundaries of conventional etiquette, gathering in living rooms transformed by phonographs to share music that had once been confined to concert halls, hosting house parties where dancing, conversation, and laughter flowed late into the night, and cultivating friendships and romances in public spaces previously dominated by strict codes of conduct, thereby reconfiguring the social map of community, intimacy, and cultural engagement. Young women bobbed their hair, shortened their skirts, and adopted the liberated movements of the Charleston, signaling not merely a fashion trend, but a profound statement about autonomy, bodily freedom, and participation in public life, while men navigated changing expectations for courtship, entertainment, and engagement with a wider social world, creating an atmosphere in which traditional hierarchies of behavior and authority were questioned, reinterpreted, and often overturned in favor of personal choice, experimentation, and collective exhilaration. Public spaces, too, became laboratories of cultural transformation, where all-night diners and illuminated streets allowed for interactions across generations, classes, and ethnicities that had previously been constrained by social or geographic boundaries, fostering a shared sense of possibility, curiosity, and engagement in which Americans could observe, imitate, and participate in behaviors once regarded as scandalous or unconventional, in doing so, reshape their own identities in real time. Even the act of leisure itself became a symbol of autonomy. Travel, home entertainment, communal festivals, and endurance contests were not simply ways to pass time, but arenas in which participants actively negotiated the meaning of freedom, pleasure, and social belonging, and in which audiences, whether local or from distant towns, could partake in the cultural drama, absorbing the lessons, humor, and excitement of experimentation as observers, chroniclers, and occasional participants. This broad engagement with new forms of entertainment, interaction, and self-expression reflected a deeper cultural current in which Americans were redefining the rules of engagement, asserting agency in their personal and social lives, and cultivating an ethos in which curiosity, audacity, and openness to innovation were celebrated rather than constrained, creating a decade in which the pursuit of happiness, community, and identity converged in ever-changing forms of public and private exploration. From the wild energy of urban nightlife to the structured excitement of suburban leisure, from the physical daring of endurance spectacles to the intimate creativity of home-based entertainment, the decade was a crucible in which tradition met modernity, and where the bold, imaginative, and sometimes reckless experimentation of ordinary people carved pathways for social freedoms that would resonate for generations, demonstrating that the 1920s were far more than a series of parties and fashions. They were a profound cultural awakening, a collective reimagining of how Americans could live, play, and connect with one another in ways that challenged expectations, embraced novelty, and celebrated the thrill of human possibility. When we step back and look at the 1920s in their entirety, it becomes clear that this was not simply a decade of frivolous parties, flashy fashion, or fleeting fads. Rather, it was a period in which American leisure, social behavior, and cultural expression were fundamentally and irrevocably transformed, blending audacious risk, daring innovation, and a bold reimagining of what public and private life could look like, creating a landscape in which individuals were the young flappers twirling to jazz, families exploring the countryside by automobile, or spectators marveling at endurance contests were actively participating in the creation of a new cultural reality, one that celebrated autonomy, curiosity, and the freedom to redefine norms. Every aspect of daily life, from the clandestine thrill of speakeasies to the communal excitement of baseball games and cinema screenings, contributed to a rich tapestry of experiences in which pleasure, experimentation, and social connection were not merely tolerated, but enthusiastically pursued, establishing patterns of engagement, interaction, and cultural consumption that would ripple across subsequent decades and inform the very way Americans understood leisure, identity, and community. The transformative power of this era lay not only in its capacity to entertain or thrill, but in its ability to break boundaries and challenge long-standing social hierarchies, from gender roles to class expectations, blending sophistication with audacity and playfulness with profound social commentary. Innovations like radio and automobiles, once mere technological novelties, became catalysts for cultural democratization, enabling ordinary Americans to access experiences that had previously been restricted to the wealthy, the urban elite, or those with particular social connections, and in doing so, leveling the playing field for participation, experimentation, and enjoyment, while simultaneously fostering a shared sense of national identity that was dynamic, diverse, and unmistakably modern. Even the era's eccentricities, the extended dance marathons, flagpole sitters, and house parties filled with phonographs and spirited conversation, revealed a society eager to explore the limits of endurance, creativity, and social imagination, where risk was met with exhilaration, novelty inspired emulation, and the boundaries of acceptable behavior were perpetually renegotiated in both private and public spheres. Ultimately, the 1920s redefined what it meant to live, play, and connect in America, leaving behind a legacy that intertwined pleasure with purpose, innovation with expression, and liberation with community, illustrating that leisure was never merely a passive pastime, but a vibrant, multidimensional space where social, technological, and cultural currents intersected to create opportunities for self-discovery, collective participation, and the exhilaration of shared human experience. It was a decade that embraced both chaos and creativity, danger and delight, structure and spontaneity, and in doing so, established a blueprint for modern American life in which risk, ingenuity, and the pursuit of enjoyment were inseparable from the evolving definition of freedom itself, leaving an indelible imprint on the nation's consciousness, its cultural practices, and its enduring fascination with the possibilities of human agency and innovation in the public and private spheres alike. In this whirlwind of transformation, free time itself became a rich and malleable resource, a canvas upon which Americans painted new experiences, gained social interactions, and experimented with forms of entertainment that were as diverse as they were exhilarating, where no two weekends or even evenings necessarily resembled one another, and every choice carried the potential for discovery, excitement, or social distinction. Families, newly empowered by the automobile, could pack a lunch, pile into the car, quaint, and traverse miles of countryside that had previously been accessible only to the wealthy or the adventurous few, exploring scenic routes, camping along rivers and lakes, or simply enjoying the novel sensation of independence that came from traveling at one's own pace, deciding where to stop and what sights to behold along the way, transforming ordinary landscapes into arenas of leisure and imagination. In urban centers, evenings might be devoted to house parties where phonographs filled rooms with jazz. Dance marathons tested endurance, or intimate gatherings allowed neighbors to share conversation, music, and culinary delights, turning private homes into vibrant spaces of communal engagement. While public venues, from all-night diners to illuminated streets lined with theaters and amusement parks, provided stages where social norms could be tested, flotation could be pursued, and collective exhilaration could be celebrated, creating a dynamic interplay between individual choice and social expectation that made leisure both intensely personal and broadly communal. Sports, too, offered arenas for both participation and spectatorship that redefined the concept of free time. Stadiums and arenas filled with cheering crowds, eager to witness the feats of legendary athletes like Babe Ruth and Jack Dempsey, where baseball and boxing became not merely games but national spectacles, infused with drama, personality, and the power to unite strangers in collective excitement and admiration. While emerging media, from silent films to radio broadcasts, ensured that these cultural touchstones could reach households across cities, towns, and rural communities alike, fostering a shared consciousness that linked Americans in ways previously unimaginable. Even within the home, leisure was infused with creativity, curiosity, and social experimentation. As families gathered to play word games, listen to music, dance, or engage in spirited discussions inspired by newsreels, magazines, or radio programming, bridging private enjoyment with the wider currents of contemporary culture, and transforming everyday life into a microcosm of the era's broader innovations, risks, and pleasures. Ultimately, Americans in the 1920s spent their free time exploring a remarkable array of possibilities, mixing physical vitality, social experimentation, cultural consumption, and technological innovation into a singular experience that was simultaneously playful, challenging, and transformative, reflecting the decade's profound redefinition of leisure as a multidimensional, socially and culturally charged space in which risk, creativity, and liberation converged, leaving a legacy in which the simple act of enjoying one's free hours could be at once thrilling, socially meaningful, and emblematic of the era's extraordinary spirit of exploration, audacity, and imagination, and in doing so, it's illustrating that for this generation, the boundaries of recreation were limited only by curiosity, courage, and the willingness to embrace the unknown. As we reflect on the dizzying decade of the 1920s, it becomes clear that the reality beneath the glittering surface of flappers, jazz, and endless parties was far more complex, nuanced, and transformative than popular imagination often allows. While films and popular culture have painted the era as a non-stop world of sequins, champagne, and carefree revelry, the truth was that Americans were navigating a world in flux, where every thrill carried risk, every new freedom prompted social negotiation, and every innovation reshaped the way people lived, connected, and experienced leisure. Prohibition, ostensibly enacted to curb the dangers of alcohol, inadvertently transformed the nation's nightlife into a labyrinth of hidden speakeasies, illicit bars, and underground networks where both excitement and danger coexisted, and where the very act of drinking became a statement of defiance, community, and audacious independence. The closure of legal saloons did not eliminate desire, it merely pushed it into shadowed rooms, into secret back entrances where passwords and whispered signals dictated entry, and where illegal alcohol flowed freely, often dangerously, leading to tragic consequences, even as it offered the thrill of participation in something forbidden and exhilarating. In these shadowed social spaces, Americans experienced freedom of interaction and connection on a scale previously unimaginable. Men and women who had once been segregated by convention and propriety could now share a dance, a drink, or a conversation without the formalities that had long defined public life. Young women, embracing the flapper ethos, bobbed their hair, shortened their skirts, and moved their bodies with abandon, signaling both personal liberation and a broader cultural shift toward equality, autonomy, and public presence. The Charleston and other dances became not mere entertainment, but symbols of a generation willing to challenge the physical, social, and moral constraints inherited from the Victorian era, celebrating motion, expression, and audacity in ways that thrilled audiences and unsettled traditional observers alike. In parallel, organized crime flourished, harnessing the enormous demand for illegal alcohol and transforming speakeasies into arenas of tension, power, and social negotiation, reminding Americans that risk was never confined to playful experimentation. It was also entwined with danger, negotiation, and the unpredictable consequences of a society redefining itself at breakneck speed. Beyond nightlife, leisure in the 1920s expanded into myriad forms, each reflecting a desire for novelty, teasement, personal agency, and collective participation. House parties, phonographs, and radio broadcasts brought music, dance, and conversation into the intimacy of the home, allowing people to craft social experiences on their own terms. While public events, with their roaring baseball games, prize fight spectacles, or the communal bustle of all-night diners offered spaces for collective engagement, celebration, and the veneration of heroes like Babe Ruth and Jack Dempsey, larger-than-life personas bridged sport, celebrity, and national identity in ways that had never before been possible. Cinema amplified these cultural currents with silent films, European artistic innovations, the carefully curated lives of movie stars influencing fashion, behavior, and aspiration, further linking personal entertainment with emerging media, technology, and a shared national consciousness. The technological transformations of the era were equally revolutionary. Radios brought music, news, and entertainment directly into homes, democratizing access to culture and fostering shared experiences that connected urban and rural Americans alike, while automobiles reshaped both the geography and the rhythm of daily life, enabling families to explore their surroundings, take extended road trips, and engage in leisure travel that had once been the exclusive domain of the wealthy. Urban landscapes glimmered with electric light, extending the possibilities of nightlife, and planned suburbs emerged, reflecting a new model of residential living shaped around mobility, convenience, and family-centered recreation. At the same time, unique cultural fads, flagpole sitting, marathon dancing, and endurance contests of every imaginable variety provided spaces for both spectacle and participation, reinforcing a collective ethos in which audacity, curiosity, and physical daring were celebrated and rewarded. Taken together, these myriad transformations revealed that the 1920s were not merely a decade of surface-level glamour, but a crucible in which American social life, leisure practices, and cultural expectations were actively reimagined. Its free time became a site for experimentation, joy, and discovery, whether through the thrill of dance, the camaraderie of sporting events, the intimacy of home-based entertainment, or the open road, where adventure, freedom, and self-expression converged. Risk, innovation, and social liberation were intertwined in every experience, making the decade a remarkable period in which ordinary people, through their choices, occasions, and appetites for novelty collectively redefined what it meant to live fully, freely, and creatively. So as we close this journey into the roaring yet complex 1920s, we can see that beneath the sequence in jazz lay a society exploring the edges of freedom, embracing both danger and delight, and redefining the ways humans could socialize, entertain themselves, can connect with one another in an age of extraordinary transformation. And now, as your own day winds down and you pull the covers close, take a moment to imagine the pulse of that era, the laughter spilling from secret doorways, the engines of new automobiles, the rhythm of jazz echoing through homes and streets. And allow yourself to drift into a restful sleep, carrying with you the vibrant, daring, and unforgettable spirit of a decade that taught Americans and all of us that freedom, curiosity, and creativity can turn even ordinary moments into extraordinary adventures. Good night, and sleep well.